In the last 2 hours, 20 priests among 100 killed in Cuba plane crash. Cuba mourns 107 victims of State Airways plane crash. Company that leased plane in Cuba crash. To be audited in the last 4 hours. Black box retrieved at site of Cuba plane crash. Plane crash in Cuba. Rescuers find black box. PNP mourns with people of Cuba in the last 6 hours. JA reaches out to Cuba following plane crash. Company in Cuba plane crash had received safety complaints. Cuba plane crash leaves 110 dead, 3 injured. Officials say in the last 8 hours. Cuba plane crash update: 110 died in plane crash, 3 survivors critical. Cuba plane crash leaves 110 dead, 3 injured, official says. Today video, Cuba in mourning after the worst plane crash since 1989. Deadly crash spotlights Cuba Airlines woes. Officials say company in Cuba airliner crash had safety complaints. Iran sympathizes with Cuba over plane crash. Cuba plane crash, but we know Boeing 737 crash in Cuba kills 110. Yesterday 110 killed in plane crash in Cuba, 3 survivors critical. Cuba in mourning after jet crash, 110 confirmed dead. Cuba confirms 110 killed in country's deadliest plane crash since 1989. Cuba, 110 confirmed dead in plane crash as black box found. Update: black box found in Cuba plane crash. Officials say company in Cuba crash had safety complaints. Cuba, 110 died in plane crash, 3 survivors critical. Cuba confirms 110 dead in plane crash. State-run media. Cuba confirms 110 dead in plane crash. State-run media. 20 priests among dead in Cuba plane crash. Boeing 737 crash. Cuba mourns 110 victims. 110 confirmed dead in Cuba Boeing 737 plane crash. Cuba, 3 airliner crash survivors critical. Flight recorder located. Cuba, 3 survivors critical after crash of jet carrying 110. 3 survivors critical after crash of Cuba jet carrying 110. Cuba plane crash. Black box recovered. Cuba plane crash. Black box recovered in good condition. Condolences pour in as Cuba mourns. Crash victims. Death toll in Cuba plane crash climbs to 113 as black box retrieved. Video investigation underway as Cuba mourns plane crash. 3 survivors of Cuba plane crash in critical state. Cuba condoled over plane crash. Cuba in mourning after worst plane crash in nearly 30 years. The latest. Cuba, 3 survivors critical after plane crash. Cuba mourns after over 100 killed in plane crash. Crew relatives of Mexican plane crash traveled to Cuba. Update: plane in Cuba crash was poorly maintained, alleges former pilot. Erdogan offers condolences over Cuba plane crash. Mourning period begins in Cuba for more than 100 victims of plane crash. Cuba in mourning after deadly plane crash. 3 survivors hospitalized after Cuba plane crash. Cuba grieves 107 killed in crash of aging airliner. Cuba, Mexico officials probe fatal plane crash. Cuba mourns after 107 killed in plane crash. Cuba probe plane crash. 3 survivors in critical condition. 3 survivors in grave condition after airliner carrying 110 crashes in Cuba. Boeing 737 crash in Cuba kills 107. Cuba woke up in duel after aviation accident. Only 3 survive. Cuba plane crash that kills more than 100. Erdogan offers condolences over Cuba plane crash. Cuba plane crash site, very painful, seen only 3 survivors in Cuba's worst aviation disaster in 3 decades. International community expresses sorrow over plane crash in Cuba. Armenia president condoles with Cuba counterpart. Iran condoles with Cuba over plane crash. Cuba, more than 100 people dead in country's worst air disaster in 30 years. Cuba plane crash, no Malaysians affected. President expresses condolences to the head of Cuba. More than 100 killed in Cuba plane crash. Cuba mourns plane crash victims. Iran condoles with Cuba over deadly plane crash. Cuba plane crash, more than 100 people killed. Ramaphosa sends condolences to Cuba. Following plane crash. Airplane crashes in Cuba with 110 aboard. 3 survive plane crashes on takeoff in Cuba, killing more than 100. No Ukrainians among victims of plane crash. In Cuba, Foreign Ministry. Only 3 survive in Cuba's worst air disaster in 30 years. Video, more than 100 dead in Cuba plane crash. Terrifying video captures chaotic minutes.